Okay, hello, welcome to Hobbies with Robbie. This is our inaugural first show. It is the show where we talk to people about the things that they like to do, love to do, and are passionate about. Today I have a wonderful guest named Josh Paynter. Josh is an American luminary in the Taoism and Chinese medicine world, and but we're probably only going to touch tangentially on those things today because what we're going to do is to talk to Josh about his hobbies, of which he has many, and so doubtless it will be an illuminating and wonderful conversation. Hello, Josh.
Hey,
Could you please tell our viewers a little bit about who you are and touch briefly on your professional life so that they can have some sort of idea about what you do? And then we're going to throw all that stuff aside and just talk about having
okay. Well, right now, professionally, I do Chinese medicine, acupuncture and herbs, and also a branch of Chinese medicine called Juyo or even Fuzhou, depending on, so it's talismanic medicine. And so that's what I do every day. And I also teach in a Taoist program called Parting Clouds that my brothers, Jack Schaefer and Ross Rosen and I sort of run together. Um, and that's how I spend my every week and I also am a father of three kids. One of them is going to college in the fall and the other two are younger than that. And so I'm busy with them as well. And I live in the country, so I have a lot of fallen trees to cut and all of that stuff, random country chores all the time that always show up unbidden. So that's a basic week for me.
That's amazing. So I think that that is all really wonderful stuff. And actually, we will put links for your various projects in the description of this video. But today, it's all about actually what the things that you do as hobbies that bring you joy. I want to before we get into your origin story, because I think all great super hobby heroes need to have an origin story. But before we get into that, I just want to point out that there are existent photos of you doing I think it's an indie grab or like a method grab on a skateboard
Yeah.
from the 1980s.
Yeah.
Can you touch on that a little bit, because that's rad, as they say.
Well, the 80s were definitely my that was my decade. But it is interesting though, considering the how sort of in our adult lives we tend to get our labels, Josh Taoist medicine or Taoist guy and Chinese medicine guy, and those are the limits of my many of my relationships, and it's a context for many of my relationships, I should say. And I noticed that, a lot of other Taoist teachers suffer from the same type of thing, or Chinese medicine practitioners. I mean, that's what we are as our job. And I really struggle with that, because that, on my feed, I have a few pictures of me that are, it's hard to say, like, how I struggle with social media, because I have this professional life. Not that I lead two lives, there's nothing dishonest going on. It's just that the appreciation and relationships that I have for others and they for me generally fall into the spheres of Chinese medicine and Taoism. But my brothers and I and our upbringing was very much in a different range of things, being with children of artists and all of what that means in terms of their friends and our lives and our jobs and all of that, and our worldview. And so the growing up, my mother was like a radical, and so I was very not, I wouldn't call myself like highly politicized, but I was definitely like not mainstream. And um, in the 80s, the best place for me to end up was the New York hardcore scene. And that was where I matured, was inside those clubs and in that scene, and doing stick and poke tattoos, or an illegal tattoo studio in Massachusetts, and you know, all kinds of great and amazing things, uh, experiences, and all of that stuff that New York in the 80s actually afforded outside of the hardcore scene. Just the art scene and the whole, the whole realm of all of that is really where I matured in a lot of ways. And it's interesting how that stuff really dictated where I went to college, because I went to a college that I felt would really jive with those views. And so I went to a college that did that. That was Bard College. And there is where I was introduced to Taoism by my parents, but only insofar as Jia Fufeng's Dao De Jing and Zhuangzi were on the shelf, And so other than perusal of those and a deep interest in China through Kung Fu movies, I really had no idea what was going on. And so in 91 is when I met my mentor, Lisa Rafels, at Bard College. And that's where the sort of alternative world of Bard College and Taoism sort of were welded together for me. And that's where it all began.
That's a wonderful origin story. And the other thing I really appreciate about it is that right at the very start of your exposition there, you got around to really the main point of what this show is supposed to be about, which is about talking to people who are known to do one thing or two things, and then showing people who follow them or might be interested in them, their human side, and like, where they're coming from and what they're interested in. Because I do also find that there's a real pigeonholing that happens, and it's not just us in that Taoism or internal arts or whatever scene that you happen to be part of, or that we're all part of. It's everybody. Anybody who has a name on the internet, unfortunately, is kind of becomes a caricature in a sense.
Yeah.
And so my goal here is to tear that down as best as possible. But so that New York hardcore scene back in the day, I believe that you met Henry Rollins.
No, I've met Henry, yeah.
Multiple times.
Yeah. Among other people, that's the thing. It's like, if you're in the right time at the right place at the right time, history will look back at that and think it's monumental, but at the time, these were non-monumental people and moments. The clubs were only as big as my acupuncture office.
A lot of people, though, at the time. Like,
yeah.
That's exciting. I was in the sort of peripheral to the Toronto punk scene in the 90s. And that punk scene brought us such wonderful acts as a bunch of fine gentlemen whose hit song was Alcohol a Day turned Alcoholocaust. So know a little bit about the hardcore scene, and I'm glad that I'm too old for it. Anyway, so moving on, is that bracelet that you're wearing, did you make that?
Yeah, so this is just a brass bracelet. It's very simple. It's a simple little thing. But I was a jeweler, and I do continue to do metalwork as a hobby. My great-grandfather was a jeweler. My grandmother could do jewelry. My father was a jeweler, and my father also apprenticed with a famous jade carver, Frank Long, and then I worked as a professional, what would you call it, production jeweler. I did my own designs too, but those all went to my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife.
So nice.
Yeah, she is the sole recipient of my custom work, but I did do a lot of stone setting and really complicated, sometimes one piece would have, I don't know, maybe more than 10 joints on it, solder joints, which is hard to do. I don't know anybody would appreciate that, but definitely the in low light with the torch and different metals, you learned the Tao of each metal, that by its color, by the smell, by the surface, makes these weird little reticulations when it's about to behave in certain ways. And so you become, it's so corny, you become one with the metal. And so I loved making jewelry. And I also worked for some great ceramic artists. And that was amazing too. Mud is amazing. And the techniques of glazing and firing, and just the idea of this stuff that's dug up from riverbanks becoming what it becomes, was also like glorious. And I yearn to do that again as well, but that requires some serious equipment, and I don't want to burn my house down. But yeah, jewelry, ceramics, and graffiti.
Well, I understand that your country has a legal code which allows you to be exonerated of many different types of past crimes after the 5-year point. So it's okay, man. You just speak your heart. You wait till you see the next guest that I'm going to have on here. Anyway, but no, that's really cool. So you're into or have been or are into graffiti too. I've seen some of your drawing. Like, I mean, you're a prolific water painter, but we'll get into that. But I've seen some of your drawings that you've done, that you've put up on Facebook, that are sort of in a graffiti style. Do you want to touch on that a little bit? I feel like today's really the day where we're getting into
Yeah.
personal histories with Josh.
Yeah. Well, graffiti was part of the urban culture. So the hip hop scene and the hardcore scene in New York in the 80s were kind of like at the perimeter, intermeshed, but not entirely, clearly. They were very different communities. But there's a great New York acupuncturist, Freddie Alva, who's done 2 books called Urban Styles, which are about the hardcore scene and graffiti. And a bunch of my friends are in those books, as the author is a friend of mine as well. And so, graffiti for me, especially depending on the cap, like a fat cap, when used in different ways, is very much like a calligraphic stroke. And the movement of that paint and the fluidity and the flow of the spray makes for a really interesting thing that's unlike a brush, but also like a brush. And the hand style that each person develops in terms of how they write letters, how you make an E, how you make an R. K is my favorite letter. So, you have all of these things because each letter has a different potential for form, just like your choice when we do grassy style, cao shu in calligraphy. That's where your identity comes out. Or even in kaishu, the standard print form, you get to choose how you do each particular stroke, vertical, horizontal, hooked, or whatever. Your identity as a calligrapher comes out. And so it's the same with graffiti, which was I'd started doing we'll talk about it in a minute, Chinese calligraphy when I was 3, literally, with my grandmother. But the graffiti definitely was my teenage years. Moving spray paint around was unbelievable and exciting. And color is nice too.
I'd be really interested to know what Mao Zedong's fat cap style looks like. Just to give some context to those people who may not know what the heck I'm talking about. Mao Zedong was a very, very well known for his calligraphy, and is considered one of the sort of great innovators of the 20th century. Just to give a little bit more context, somebody who I know said something interesting, which is the reason why he's so well known during that era is because there's nobody else to compare him to. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. So, leaving that noble topic and moving on to, I have a question about your graffiti career. Did you ever get in trouble with the oink oink?
No.
Wow.
No. Lots of close calls, because that's the nature of that art form. But I also had like personal rules about what and where. Yeah. So I oddly enough, I had like a deep respect for private property, and also a fear of incarceration. I do know kids who actually went to jail for it, which is preposterous, but they did. It's not just
Wow,
a
it is,
fun
that is
thing.
pretty preposterous.
Yeah. But I would go to I came from a broke down factory town, so there were a lot of abandoned factories, and they were Victorian factories, so the way they were laid out was such that light could come into the building, so they weren't too deep. They were like long hallways, and they were arranged like a comb, and so there were a lot of little places to hide in there and work on your style. So anyway, that was how we did it. I was never one of those awesome train writers and stuff like that. That was beyond me. The train
So
yards are a
if we were to
scary
go back
place.
to your hometown, could we could find one of these Victorian labyrinthian Josh art factories potentially?
No, my town has undergone some strange rehab where they tore all the factories down and put and some of the factories were changed into these upscale apartment complexes, and some of them were just torn down flat and gone. But the town
Well,
is different.
I guess gentrification serves as a form of impermanence. So there we
Yeah,
go.
yeah.
So now I have so many questions for you, man. So another question I have, well, I just wanted to touch on the cops because you were a skateboarder too. Now, I mean, you know, we can talk about what places you skated in. I just want to give a personal little anecdote today. I went out on my skateboard this morning, and I rode past a cop car and practiced my no complies. And where I come from, the cops were very, very aggressive with us when we were kids. I remember a 14-year-old friend of mine getting his arm broken by a cop twisting it behind his back. So it's I'm so happy that these days the society has accepted skateboarding, and it's not you can do it on you can do it on Fox TV. That's how accepted it is now. So that's pretty
Yeah,
cool.
yeah.
But
Well, back then
yeah,
it was really in the 80s, of course, we were constantly hassled by the police. My friends were choked by them just for, you know, being on the on the street, let alone getting a call on private property like a parking lot at the grocery store. Um, but there was a constant friction with the police and skateboarding. That's back in those days. They had those big that's when the sticker, "The skateboarding is not a crime," came out. It was just like kids all over the country were getting arrested for it. It's so weird to think that this national, suburban pastime now was at once, some weird counterculture. The way we dressed, talked, listened to different music, the whole thing was a very alternative scene, and it was directly at odds with the police and neighborhood associations or whatever. I didn't live in that kind of town, but I know that other people do. But it was definitely a strange reality. But the thing about skateboarding for me, and I used to skate at the Brooklyn Banks in New York under the Brooklyn
uh,
Bridge. There was this
very
awesome,
famous spot.
yeah,
For
that
those
was
who
great.
don't know, it's one of the most famous skate spots in videos.
Oh yeah. So we were there, and all down the lower New York was great in a lot of places to skate. A lot of good weird railings that were around in the various in fronts of office buildings and stuff. Um, and of course, the hangout was Soho Skates, which was there and gone. I don't, it wasn't there for long, but that was like the Mecca, and that was an amazing place. And but skateboarding was my martial art. It was the things that we used to do physically. I look at it now, pictures of us and little videotapes, which I'm having a harder time watching at this point. We don't even have the device. I have to put it on a camera, and we'll use all kinds of equipment. But the things we used to do back then were so extraordinary physically. I'm really surprised by it, in general. And the reflexes and balance and strength and grace that is embodied by skateboarding is really amazing to me. And I
That's
want to do it.
amazing.
I want to do it again. But
Hey, look, man, when we get together after when it's possible to get together, we'll
yeah,
go on a little skate. I'm not promising anything special, but neither are you. So,
no.
but I did want to I'm going to get off the skateboarding topic in just a
Mm.
sec, but I think it's really interesting to know that when you skateboarded, it was actually a really transitional era, because it was the time, I think, when I'm not even going to touch on Bert, but when Rodney Mullen
Yeah.
had started to make up all those crazy tricks,
Yeah.
and then people started applying them to street skateboarding. So you guys would have been right at the start there,
So
around when people started to skate rails and steps, right?
no, that I remember when the advent of those styles. So when we started, it was maybe the late 70s with those banana boards, those plastic, very small, very soft, very long wheels that were sort of hollow and conical on the inside. So they sort of flexed oddly and everything like that. And then I remember when I got my first bigger wooden board. It was a Jeff Phillips by Sims. And I don't even know how I remembered that. That was 1984 or 5, something like that. And at that time, I remember some kid moved to my town from somewhere else and said, "Do you guys know how to ollie?" And none of us even had heard that word. You know what I mean? It was 70s dudes going on, just like carving stuff. You know what I mean? That was our archetype, was these long-haired dudes carving concrete. And then the ollie came, and then the launch ramp, and then half pipes were built, and then railings were discovered, and irrigation ditches were on films. So we started looking in urban environments for things like that, just concrete slanted things in natural environments. And I remember Rodney Mullen, he had that little board that was double-ended, because boards weren't back then. They had a nose and a tail. They didn't have that symmetrical shape. Mine is right there.
Woo! Is it possible for you to grab and show us?
Yeah, but this one is cool. This is my special one for my office.
Ooh. Oh, wow. That is so cool. Oh my God. That's amazing.
Yeah, this one is the anatomy. So yeah, that I remember back then what Rodney was doing, we all called freestyle. It wasn't incorporated into the repertoire. I mean, skateboarding was divided into vert, street, and freestyle. So there would be launch ramps and things like that. Then Rodney would do his demonstrations, because I skated a few times with the Bones Brigade.
Wow.
Yeah.
Holy.
But it was always like, very compartmentalized, you know what I mean? And Tony did his thing, and Caballero did his thing. I just remember Steve Caballero had that deformity or whatever, that his neck was tilted. And we all skated like him because we thought it was part of the way he skated. So we literally imitated his messed up neck because it looked cool. And you know what I mean? And Mike Vallely had that shaved head back then. And I was like, I'm doing that. These guys were major heroes. But anyway, so I remember I had stopped skating for a little while when I went to college. And in that transitional time, Rodney Mullen's style deck became the only deck you can buy anymore, or at least the ubiquitous style. And I remembered the whole style had changed. It was like this weird mix of freestyle and street at the same time. It was so cool, but I was already out of the loop at that time in the 90s.
Yeah.
But
well, that's super cool, man. These days, so when I was a kid, I was skating from probably about like 94 until about 2000. And when I was a kid, the skateboards that you would get would have been these little like 7.5 inch things. 8 inches was considered very, very wide. And for anybody who knows old school skateboarding, I mean, that's a joke. It's like a toothpick. And then now I'm so stoked to borrow one of the terminologies, because when I look around the skateboarding world, there's a lot of diversity and multi-generational stuff. There's many different genres of skateboarding happening right now. They even have people doing freestyle skateboarding like Rodney used to do with the little
Yeah.
decks. Um, it's really exciting, and I don't envy the kids these days because the bar is so high for talent. It would be difficult to get good at now. So I'm just very happy trying to relearn Ollie 180s and stuff like that. But
Yeah.
and no sliding the occasional curve. Now I do have another question though that segues into this, but it's different. You do kung fu
Mm,
to some extent.
my relationship to martial arts is weird. I would never claim. So I was a wrestler my whole life. From when I was 64 pounds, I started wrestling in fourth grade or the end of third grade. Um, and I did that all the way up through high school. And then so that physicality of that, so I'm a little bit dyslexic too. I have a very hard time facing someone doing a form and imitating them. I have a very hard time doing that. And so wrestling doesn't have that. You don't watch someone do something and then try to imitate it. So I needed contact, like I needed to feel lines of force for me to be able to understand form, which is really disadvantageous. I did when I went to college in China, I did learn a Taiji form that I got. And I studied a little bit of Xingyi with a very talented friend in New York. And I've been around the block with a few of those things, but my outside of wrestling in 1996, I started Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu with the first non-Gracie family guy to be teaching it in the States. Dave Adiv is his name, and he still teaches in New Jersey. But three of us would meet Dave in a gymnastics school, and we would wait for the little kids to leave, and we would go in after them. We were renting the hour, and that's where we originally did that. And back in those days, UFC had one or two or three of them had happened, and our teacher was trying to make a name. Well, the whole Brazilian jiu-jitsu community, which was primarily in California at the time, and of course in Brazil, we needed to make a name for it. So we were tasked with going to other schools and challenging the teacher. Or taking on all challenges in our school, which was a little hectic and weird, but really exciting at the same time. So these weren't violent encounters unless someone got really frustrated, but that was easily navigated. But at that time, there was something magical about jiu-jitsu because no one knew what the hell we were doing. And so when you grab someone back then and pull them into the guard, it's literally just pulling them and letting them fall on top of you, essentially, which is not a very skillful or hard thing to do at that time. And that would put us in a dominant position, and it would be inevitably, there would be nothing they could do. And so that really created a very interesting sort of, mystique around the whole thing. And so my main experience was with wrestling and jiu-jitsu in the 90s. But once I went to Chinese medicine school, I slowed down and lost interest because injuries were mounting. And I also, with school and my practice, and I had kids very early in my practice. I couldn't dedicate the way that I practiced. I couldn't dedicate the same amount of myself to it because I'm sort of binary. I'm either on or off of something. And when I'm on, it's on. And when I'm off, it's off. And so I couldn't do it halfway, so I stopped. But
it's interesting though, right? It's very I'm quite happy about my predictive powers here because just before we started our interview, I made a little quip about how you were studying Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and I was just joking around because one of our friends does it, but
yeah.
Then I found out that in fact, look at this, everybody look at this guy as a treasure. He has been in so many places when things were just starting to kick off that would become genre defining in not only the underground culture, but in the mainstream culture. That is so interesting. And I think it's super rad. But there's another thing you do, which is related to art, which is you are a absolutely mind-blowing painter. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I'm not mind blowing. I'm
Well,
below
you're number one.
average.
You're a painter. That's your family name. I forgot about that.
Yeah, yeah.
You're a mind-blowing painter in more than one way.
um, Luckily for me, I don't know if my destiny was dictated by the proximity um, and affection for my grandmother, or if it was I was just lucky to have her be in the world that interested me. I think it's actually she formed my interest in all things Chinese. So my grandma, and I've said this in so many different interview types of things, my grandmother was a student of Alison Stilwell Cameron, who was Joseph Stilwell's daughter, General Joseph Stilwell. So if you just look at his Wikipedia, you'll understand his importance and the enduring status he holds in China. But Alison, my grandmother's best friend, was born in China in the compound of the deposed Qing dynasty imperial family. And her first language was Chinese, and her first language was Imperial Chinese, which is unbelievable for a little white girl. It was so interesting to that. She was there at the end of dynastic China before they all moved to Taiwan. So Alison, when she was little, lived within the compound, which was like a miniature Forbidden City, and she studied painting with Puru, who was he would have been an emperor had the dynastic cycle continued. But he is one of the considered to be one of the greatest Qing dynasty and after Republican era painters. So Alison studied with him, and then Alison married a military man, and so did my grandmother. And they happened to both be stationed in Ecuador at the same time in an embassy scenario there. My grandfather was working with the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is like the defense wing of the CIA. But anyway, she, the ladies of the embassy, as they would be called or whatever in those grotesque times, did nothing but prepare cocktail hours and stuff like that. Horrible. So these women were better than that. And so they decided that they would teach each other any skill they had. And Alison had these Chinese painting classes. This was in the 60s. And my grandmother took to it and really took to it. And so spent the rest of her life studying Chinese painting, exhibiting in China, being recognized in China as an example of a foreign master and all of that. And when I was born in 1973, she was sort of at the height of her career. And so when I was old enough to hold a brush, she started with me. And I have my first ever little strokes doing bamboo leaves or whatever. They're kind of nutty looking, but I was 3. And when I would go and visit her, we would work on this stuff in the style, in the manner that she was taught, which started with bamboos and then moved to the leaves and then moved to whatever. There's a very typical and it's laid out in such a way that's a tradition. And so that was all along underneath all of the other things that we've been talking about. That was there. And that's what led me when I got to college. Well, before I got to college, when I was in high school, I was tattooed, I was skateboarding and a New York hardcore scene, and much to her chagrin. And so she felt that my brother and I should go visit my uncle, who at that time was living in Singapore. And so one summer in 1990, we were supposed to go in 89. That was not a good year, the summer of 89 in China.
Oh, no, it's
yeah.
true.
So we went in 90 instead, and we went throughout southern China and Hong Kong and Singapore and Malaysia. And I remember being really miffed that I couldn't understand what the hell was going on. And I knew that these tour people were I would ask a question and they'd give me like these funny answers, and I knew it couldn't be what just transpired. You know what I mean? So I vowed to go back to China understanding the language. So I went to college intending to be a Chinese arts history major. And I was able to study with Patricia Koretsky, who's like a really good and well-known Chinese art historian, or a Buddhist art historian. And I couldn't do art history like I wanted to, because I realized I needed language and history. You have to understand, how is the Tang different from the Song? Why would that have produced two different styles of art? I mean, the Tang dynasty art was very Buddhist central, and the Song dynasty art was very Chinese. And so why were those conditions different? And I needed to get into the history of all that. And then that led me, one thing led to another. And then I was just only taking Chinese language, Chinese history, Taoism classes. I was writing a senior thesis on that, and I decided I had to go to college in China to make this all work a little bit better. So then I went to Yunnan Daxue in Kunming. And that's, all of it's tied together, you know, it all is a very simple flow of one thing leading to the next. And so the calligraphy was sort of like in all of that. You know, when I was in college in China, I studied with some great calligraphers there. And what calligraphy is for me is like, I consider other things hobbies, but calligraphy for me isn't in the same category. It's a contemplative practice for me. And I wish it weren't, because I take it, in that sense, I take it a little too seriously because of that. You know, I wish I could go back to having a little more fun with it. And I try to do that, but it's difficult because I'm very judgmental of my style, and I will crack a scroll in half if it doesn't look exactly right.
Well, you know, I think this is something that is really a valuable thing to think about, which is that although people have hobbies and passions and things like that that they derive immense pleasure from, sometimes those things actually can induce a certain amount of stress due to the fact that either we're not, you know, maybe we're not quite where we want to be with them, or sometimes we can't take them in the directions we might like to take them. So I think that's a really salient and interesting point that you just brought up there.
Yeah.
Now I want to wrap it up pretty soon.
Mhm.
And but I do want to give you a little bit of time to just mention anything that you didn't get to that you wanted to talk about, and then maybe if you want to plug your project a little bit. This is going to be on a different YouTube channel from my normal one, so you know there may be different viewers. So please feel free to tell us about anything that you haven't mentioned that you wanted to mention, and do a little plug.
Oh, I have nothing to plug, but I would mention that I like to fly kites.
Awesome.
Yeah. Like, I have this really weird thing about flying kites. Those are the two-stringed ones, the stunt kites or whatever they're called. That's all I would say.
That was beautiful. Okay, well, okay, let's just wrap it up right there. He likes to fly kites.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I'm gonna just I will say that Josh and his Taoist brother Jack and Ross, they run a really cool Taoist education program called Parting Clouds Daoist Education, and they have put out a bunch of translations of Taoist documents. So if that may be a hobby that you are into or that you are interested in, then I certainly recommend checking them out, and there will be a link in the description. Josh, thank you so much for coming on
Yeah.
the show. Please stick around for a sec
Sure.
after we turn off the recording. And that was really, really cool and really fun. And I feel like having you as the inaugural guest was a wonderful decision, because the degree of sort of the tapestry and depth and you know, just amazing detail of both your life of passions and also you know, sort of your personal history, I think is just so fascinating, and I'm sure that everybody who watched and will watch will be totally mesmerized. So thank you again.
Thank you. That was really fun.
Okay.